Domain 1, Lesson 7, John Henry. In the 1860s, the United States was growing quickly. Immigrants were pouring in, and the railroad companies were laying train tracks that would carry the settlers west. One of the railroad companies was called the Chesapeake and Ohio, or the C&O for short. C&O Railroad was named for the two bodies of water it was intended to connect, the Chesapeake Bay along the east coast and the Ohio River in the west. The engineers who planned the C&O Railroad had to overcome many challenges in order to get the trains from the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River, but no challenge was greater than this. They had to run their tracks through the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians were like big walls that separated the east from the west. Sometimes, when the mountains were rolling more like hills, the C&O workers were able to lay tracks over the top of them. Other times they were able to lay track that zigzagged around the mountains like a snake. But some mountains were too tall to go over and too big to go around. In those cases, the only solution was to dig a tunnel right through the mountain. Digging tunnels was dangerous work. The tunnels were dark and poorly ventilated. That means that there was barely enough fresh air inside the tunnels for the workers to breathe. Many workers were killed by sudden cave-ins. To dig the tunnels as fast as they could, railroad workers worked in teams of two. One man would crouch down and hold the steel spike. Then the other man would hit the steel spike with a big hammer. The first man would twist the spike as much as he could. Then his partners would hit the spike with his hammer again. The two men would work together, banging and twisting, until they had driven the spike deep into the rock. Then they would pull out the spike, move to another spot, and start digging a new hole. After a while, the rock would be full of holes, like a piece of Swiss cheese. Next, the dynamite men would take over. The dynamite men would pack dynamite into the holes and detonate the explosives. Kaboom! The explosions would break up the solid rock into rubble. Then the workers would haul away the rubble, and then they would start digging again. To make the long, hard day's work go faster, the railroad workers used to have contests. They would pick two teams and see which team could drive its spike further into the mountain in a set amount of time. The winners of these contests became heroes. People would tell stories about the steel-driving men and their amazing feats. Another thing the railway workers did to pass the time when they worked was sing songs. Sometimes they would even sing songs about other steel-driving men. One of these steel-driving men was named John Henry. No one knew for certain where John Henry was from. Some said he was from Georgia. Some said he was from Tennessee. Others said he was a Virginia man. As it turns out, it seems likely that he was a former slave. He seems to have started working on the railroad sometime after the end of the Civil War. For years, people thought John Henry worked on the Big Bend Tunnel on the C&O line in what is now West Virginia, but now we think he was more likely to have worked on the Lewis Tunnel in Virginia. One thing we are sure of, that John Henry was a legend among railway workers. They sang a song that tells the story about how he was born with a hammer in his hand. John Henry became known as the most courageous man who ever worked on the railroad. Even as a young boy, he could do the work of a man. They said he had never been defeated in a steel-driving competition. They said he hit the spikes so hard that sparks flew through the air. They said John Henry could swing a 10-pound hammer from sun up to sundown and not even get tired. At first, almost all the work on the tunnels was done by hand, by workers like John Henry. Eventually, however, this began to change. People invented machines that could do some of the work. One of the machines they invented was a steam drill. This was a drill that was powered by a steam engine. The first steam engine drills were pretty good, but they were not great. The steam drills could drive a spike into the mountain for sure, but not as well as two strong, experienced railroad workers like John Henry and his partner. Over time the machines got better and better. They would eventually begin to replace the men who worked on the railroad tunnels. One day the captain of John Henry's work team brought a steel drill to the work site. He bet that steam drill could drive steel better than John Henry could. John Henry agreed to compete against the steel drill, and he swore he would do his best to beat it. John Henry said to the captain, "Well, a man ain't nothing but a man, but before I let a steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. Oh, oh, I'll die with a hammer in my hand." One of these bosses blew a whistle. John Henry went to work driving steel in the old-fashioned way, with a hammer and a spike. The captain started up the steam drill. It rattled away beside John Henry, belching steam and banging away at the mountain. The man and the machine worked side by side for several hours. Then the boss drew his whistle again. The bosses took measurements, and then they announced the results. John Henry had driven his spike a total of 15 feet into the mountain. And the steam drill? It had only drilled 9 feet. John Henry had won. He had beaten the steel drill. Now, the man that invented the steam drill, he thought he was mighty fine, but John Henry drove his 15 feet, and the steam drill only made 9. Oh, oh, the steam drill only made 9. The other railway workers roared. They were excited that John Henry had won. He had shown that a hard worker was better than a machine. But John Henry himself was in no condition to celebrate. He had worked so hard that he suffered a heart attack. John Henry hammered in the mountains, and his hammer was striking fire. Well, he hammered so hard that he broke his poor heart, and he laid down his hammer and he died. Oh, oh, he laid down his hammer and he died. The railway men carried John Henry out of the tunnel, and they laid him to rest with the other workers who had died. But the legend of John Henry lived on. The C&O Railroad was completed a few years later, and for years to come, whenever locomotives went down the C&O line past the tunnel they thought John Henry helped dig, like those who knew the story would say, "There lies John Henry, the king of the steel-driving men." They took John Henry down the tunnel, and they buried him in the sand. And every locomotive comes a-roaring by, says, "Yonder lies a steel-driving man. Oh, oh, yonder lies a steel-driving man."